You are 13 years old. The chapel is cold, the stones sweating with the damp of a late autumn morning. The smell of candle wax and wilted flowers curls in the air, clinging to your throat. Your wedding gown, heavy with gold thread, drags against the flagstones. It is made for a queen, but your shoulders ache beneath its weight. The pearls sewn into the bodice press against your skin like tiny, merciless stones. Beside you stands a man twice your age, Edmund Tudor. His hands are calloused from war, his jaw set, his eyes fixed not on you, but on a future only he can see. Around you, whispers stir like restless ghosts. The courtiers know this marriage is not about love, but power. Somewhere in those shadows, names are already being plotted: Edward IV, Richard of York, Henry VI, all threads in a web you do not yet understand. The priest's voice drones on, holy words muffled by the pounding in your ears. You hear the clink of a sword buckle as Edmund shifts beside you, and your heart clenches. You do not yet know that tonight you will conceive England's future king. And you cannot yet imagine that the kingdom will take him from your arms before you can even be his mother. Before we continue, if you're gripped by Margaret's story already, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. Share this with someone who loves history's forgotten voices, and tell me in the comments. Backhand index pointing right: if you were 13, standing in Margaret's place, would you see this marriage as duty or as a prison? Long before she was a bride at 13, Margaret Beaufort was born beneath the shadow of kings. Her bloodline traced back to John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III, a king whose sprawling brood had seeded both glory and chaos across England. John of Gaunt's legitimate heirs would one day produce kings, but his illegitimate line, the Beauforts, were legitimized only by royal decree. It was a fragile claim, half recognized and half dismissed, but in an age where crowns were won by sword and marriage, even the faintest drop of royal blood could be turned into a weapon. To her guardians, Margaret was no child. She was a title, an inheritance, a key to Lancaster's survival in a kingdom already tearing itself apart. England in the early 15th century was still glowing with the embers of Henry VI's victories in France. Agincourt, immortal glory, banners raised high. But Henry's triumphs died with him in 1422, leaving behind an infant son, Henry VI, and a regency that unraveled into weakness. By the time Margaret was born in 1443, the cracks in England's crown were widening. The House of York, through Richard, Duke of York, began to eye the throne with hungry precision. Lancaster and York were two branches from the same tree, each tracing back to Edward III, each convinced the other had stolen the right to rule. It was a family quarrel about to become a civil war. And in the midst of this storm, Margaret Beaufort, pale, devout, fragile in body but unyielding in spirit, became one of Lancaster's most valuable pieces. Her guardians, especially her ambitious mother and the crown's advisors, understood the truth. Her womb could birth a savior for the Lancastrian cause. Her marriage would not be hers to choose. For now, Margaret knelt at prayer, clutching her rosary with small hands. She believed her future was in God's keeping. In reality, it was already being written by men. England in Margaret's youth was a kingdom trembling on a knife's edge. Henry VI, crowned as a boy, was gentle, pious, and disastrously unfit to rule. He sought peace with France, where his father had once won glory, and signed away English lands in humiliating treaties. His courtiers whispered that he was more priest than king. Opposite him stood Richard, Duke of York, tall, calculating, and relentless. Through his descent from Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, Richard believed his claim to the throne outshone that of the Lancastrian Henry VI, descended from John of Gaunt. To Richard and his allies, Margaret's bloodline was a threat, not because she herself was powerful, but because her very existence as a Beaufort heiress tied Lancaster to a future that York wanted to erase. The nobility fractured. Families split across battle lines. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York became symbols of loyalty and betrayal. And through it all, children like Margaret were pawns in games far larger than themselves. While war loomed, Margaret's education centered not on girlish play but on religion and duty. She fasted, prayed, and confessed daily. The Bible was her comfort, yet her mother reminded her that God's plan worked through marriage, inheritance, and obedience. Margaret grew up with a sense of destiny pressed against her shoulders, but she could not yet see the burden it would become. Every whisper in court, every treaty signed, and every soldier armed brought the question closer. Who would Margaret Beaufort marry, and whose crown would her blood secure? As Margaret reached the fragile age of 12, her guardians began the careful game of negotiations. She was Lancaster's jewel, but also its bargaining chip. Suitors were discussed in hushed tones, each man chosen not for his character, but for his political value. The answer came in the form of Edmund Tudor, half-brother to Henry VI, the son of Queen Catherine of Valois by her second husband, Owen Tudor. Edmund was older, hardened by the politics of the realm, and already a trusted figure in Lancastrian strategy. For the king, marrying his young cousin Margaret to Edmund was a way to tighten Lancaster's grip on the future. For Margaret, it was a sentence. She was not yet 13 when the betrothal was arranged. In the eyes of the realm, her fragile body was ready. Ready to carry, ready to suffer, ready to bear the next heir of Lancaster. In her prayers, Margaret asked God for clarity, for peace, for strength. She believed her suffering was part of divine will. But beneath the holy words, a child's fear trembled. As the date of her wedding drew near, the kingdom itself teetered toward open conflict. Armies were gathering, banners unfurling, and men like Richard of York prepared to march against Henry VI. And in the center of this fragile chessboard stood Margaret Beaufort, unaware that her womb, her faith, and her endurance would become weapons as sharp as any sword. The bells of matrimony tolled, and with them, the first steps of Margaret's long and harrowing journey were set in motion. The bells of Bletsoe Priory rang out, heavy and relentless, as if the stones themselves understood the weight of the ceremony. Margaret Beaufort was just 13, her frame delicate, her face still carrying the roundness of childhood. Yet on this day she was presented as a woman, as a bride. Edmund Tudor stood beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, and more than twice her age. As the half-brother of King Henry VI, Edmund carried with him the scent of power, the iron tang of politics, and the hardened instincts of a soldier. This marriage was no romance, no whispered promise of love. It was a transaction, a calculated bond to secure the Lancastrian cause at a moment when the kingdom trembled. Beyond the priory walls, civil war brewed. Richard of York, 3rd Duke of York, pressed his claim to the throne with increasing boldness. His armies marched under the white rose banner, and whispers of rebellion drifted through every court and council. For Henry VI and his circle, Margaret's marriage to Edmund was more than a family affair. It was strategy. A child bride, but a bride with royal blood, carrying the potential to create heirs who might save Lancaster's fading grip on England. Margaret herself spoke little. She walked slowly, her heavy gown trailing behind, her eyes cast downward. The vows fell from her lips like rehearsed prayers, spoken not from desire but from duty. In her heart, she clung to faith, to the belief that suffering was God's test. But inside the chamber, when the ceremony ended and the feasting gave way to silence, she felt only dread. That night, beneath the weight of silks and expectations, Margaret stepped into the reality of marriage. She was still a child, but she would no longer be treated as one. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret's body began to betray the signs of change. She was carrying a child. The whispers in the court called it a blessing, the fulfillment of Lancaster's hope. But for Margaret, the pregnancy was a trial by fire. At just 13, her frame was too narrow, her strength too fragile. The sickness came in waves, leaving her pale and exhausted. Each movement was painful, every breath heavy. And yet, Edmund Tudor saw not her suffering, but his triumph. He had done what was required of him. He had planted the seed of Lancaster's survival. The world outside her chamber grew bloodier by the day. Richard of York continued his campaign, clashing with Lancastrian forces in battles that painted England's fields with the blood of cousins and brothers. To the lords of Lancaster, Margaret was a vessel carrying their future. To Margaret herself, She was trapped in a body that betrayed her, one that belonged more to the crown than to her own soul. Her prayers grew longer, her nights more restless. She begged God for mercy, for protection, for strength to endure. Each day was a reminder that she was both priceless and powerless. Priceless to Lancaster's cause, powerless over her own fate. And then, before the child could be born, fate struck cruelly. Edmund Tudor fell ill, or perhaps was struck by plague, and died in captivity in 1456. He was barely 26. Margaret was left alone. A widow, a child, and heavily pregnant. The courtiers whispered again, this time with pity or scorn. A girl of 13, widowed and burdened with an unborn heir. Her story could have ended here, just another tragedy lost in the Wars of the Roses. But Margaret would not disappear. She could not. Her child was destined to matter. The winter wind howled through the halls as Margaret gave birth. She was barely 14, her body stretched to its limits, her life hanging in the balance. The labor was long, agonizing, and nearly fatal. Every cry echoed with the fear that she might not survive. But at last the child was born, a son. They named him Henry Tudor. The midwives lifted him from her arms before she could even memorize his face. The infant was whisked away to be raised under guardianship, a common practice among the nobility. Margaret, weak and trembling, lay in bed staring at the ceiling beams, knowing her destiny had split in two. She was a mother, yet not truly allowed to be one. Her widowhood was not freedom. It was captivity in another form. Without Edmund, Margaret became the ward of powerful men who viewed her less as a grieving girl and more as a commodity to be remarried, redirected, repurposed. Her lands, her title, her bloodline, all were tools to be wielded by others. Yet even in her sorrow, Margaret began to harden. She wrapped herself in prayer and discipline, turning her grief into resolve. She wrote letters, studied scripture, and carried herself with a dignity far beyond her years. The courtiers might have seen a fragile widow, but Margaret knew the truth. Through her child, she had given Lancaster a future. Outside, the Civil War raged on. Richard of York fought with renewed fury, and the kingdom descended further into chaos. But within the quiet chambers where Margaret prayed, a quiet fire was kindling. She was no longer just a girl to be bartered in marriage. She was the mother of a son who, one day, could be king. And that, in the blood-soaked chessboard of England, made Margaret Beaufort far more dangerous than anyone had yet realized. The winter of 1457 was cruel, the air heavy with frost, the skies pressing down with gray. Within the walls of Pembroke Castle, Margaret Beaufort lay upon her birthing bed. She was only 13, still more child than woman, but her body was forced into the brutal trial of motherhood. The labor was long, stretching over hours that felt like centuries. Her cries echoed through the stone chambers, muffled only by the prayers of the midwives who feared she would not live to see dawn. Her frame was too narrow, her strength too fragile. At one point, silence fell, and the attendants thought both mother and child would be lost. But then, a cry pierced the air. Thin, high, defiant. A boy. He was named Henry Tudor, in honor of his dead father, Edmund. This boy would one day be crowned Henry VII of England, but in that moment, he was only a fragile newborn swaddled in cloth, cradled briefly against the chest of a trembling, pale girl who had nearly died to bring him forth. Margaret's joy lasted only moments. As was custom, the child was taken from her arms almost at once, placed into the care of others deemed more suitable for raising an heir. She was left in bed, weak, hollow, staring at the ceiling beams as the cold air seeped into her bones. She had given life to Lancaster's future, but in doing so, she had nearly lost her own. For the rest of her life, Margaret's body bore the cost of that single birth. She would never bear another child. Henry would be her only son, her only chance to leave a mark upon the turbulent kingdom. As a widow, Margaret's fate was not hers to decide. At 14, she was once again placed on the marriage market, a pawn to be moved where it suited Lancaster's cause. Her next husband was Henry Stafford, son of the Duke of Buckingham. He was nearer to her age than Edmund had been, And though no marriage in this world was free of politics, life with Stafford offered Margaret something she had never known before, a brief moment of stability. Stafford was pragmatic, a man of quieter ambition. Their union was not marked by passion, but by a certain measured kindness. He allowed Margaret her devotions, respected her discipline, and gave her space to grieve. Together they managed estates, navigated the constant demands of noble life, and attempted to survive a country collapsing into war. But even in this quieter season, Margaret's heart was torn. Her son, young Henry, was rarely at her side. Custody of such a child was never a mother's privilege, but a king's decision. Her letters to him were filled with prayers, hopes, and counsel, though she could never be certain if he read them. Each absence cut into her, each reminder that she was both mother and stranger to her own flesh and blood. Still, Margaret endured. She poured her devotion into religion, rising at dawn for prayers, fasting, and reading scripture until her eyes burned. Stafford sometimes teased her for her severity, but she never wavered. Her faith, she believed, was her anchor in a world that had already taken too much. And all the while the war pressed closer. Lancaster and York bled one another across England's fields, and Margaret could never be sure if her son's bloodline would be a blessing or a curse. The 1460s brought a shift in power. The crown passed into the hands of the Yorkists, with Edward IV seizing victory and sitting upon the throne. His queen, Elizabeth Woodville, became a figure both admired and despised, a commoner raised to royalty, her beauty and ambition as infamous as her sudden marriage to the king. For Margaret, this was a dangerous transformation. She was Lancastrian by birth, but survival required flexibility. With York now dominant, she could not afford open defiance. Instead, she watched and waited, learning the patterns of court politics. She saw how Elizabeth Woodville used charm and family alliances to secure her power. She saw how rivals, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, and others, could raise up or topple monarchs in a single season. And she began to understand that quiet endurance was not enough. Margaret's loyalty was still to her son, Henry Tudor, but to protect him, she had to navigate the Yorkist court with caution. Each bow, each whispered word, each carefully measured act of obedience was a layer of armor. She studied Elizabeth Woodville's methods, how the queen placed her kin into power, how she shielded her children, how she maintained influence in a hostile court. From her husband Henry Stafford's estates, Margaret played the role expected of her. Dutiful wife, devout noblewoman, harmless widow remarried. But beneath the surface, she was sharpening her resolve. She understood now that crowns were not won on battlefields alone. They were shaped in drawing rooms, sealed in marriages, whispered into being through alliances and betrayals. Margaret's own life had taught her one cruel lesson. Her body could no longer give heirs. But through the single child she had borne, her fragile womb had already altered the course of England's destiny. The Wars of the Roses were far from over, and in the Game of Thrones that raged between York and Lancaster, Margaret Beaufort, quiet, prayerful, underestimated, would prove far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The Wars of the Roses had already soaked England's soil in blood, but in the mid-15th century, one man rose above the chaos to decide who wore the crown. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, came to be known as the Kingmaker. Neville's wealth was legendary, his power unrivaled. Vast estates, armies of retainers, and a network of alliances gave him influence that eclipsed even kings. Though born a noble, he had grown into something larger, the hand that moved monarchs like pieces upon a chessboard. At first, Neville had stood behind Edward IV of York, helping him seize the throne in 1461. The young Edward was tall, handsome, and a warrior of undeniable charisma. With Neville's military might and political cunning, Yorkist banners flew across England. But Edward was not a man to be controlled. He shocked Neville and the kingdom by marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed commoner of beauty and ambition. It was a slight the Kingmaker could never forgive. Suddenly, his influence was challenged by the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, who were elevated to positions of wealth and power at court. Neville's loyalty wavered. Once the Yorkist king's greatest ally, he turned to Lancaster. In a dizzying display of shifting allegiances, he arranged the marriage of his daughter to Prince Edward of Westminster, the son of the deposed Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Margaret Beaufort watched these events unfold with the eye of a careful observer. To her, Neville's betrayal of Edward IV was a reminder of how fragile crowns truly were. Kings rose and fell not only on battlefields, but in private chambers where men like the kingmaker whispered their schemes. Margaret, bound by duty to her son, understood that Henry Tudor's survival depended not on who sat upon the throne today, but on how well she could maneuver through these storms of loyalty and betrayal. By the late 1470s, fortune turned once again. The kingmaker himself fell in battle at Barnet, slain by the very Yorkist cause he had once raised up. Edward IV regained his throne, stronger than ever, and for a time, peace seemed possible. But in England, peace never lasted. In 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, leaving behind a kingdom uncertain and two young sons, Edward V, aged 12, and his brother Richard, Duke of York. The boy king's reign began with promise, but within months, it descended into shadow. The king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, assumed the role of protector. At first, it was meant as a safeguard, a temporary guardianship until Edward V came of age. But whispers grew in the court, whispers that Gloucester wanted more than guardianship. Edward V and his brother were taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety. But safety was an illusion. The boys disappeared from public view, and soon after, Gloucester declared himself Richard III, rightful king. The princes never emerged from the tower. Their fate remains one of history's darkest mysteries. Whether by dagger, poison, or suffocation, most believed Richard had ordered their deaths to secure his throne. To the people of England, the princes in the tower became a chilling tale of innocence sacrificed to ambition. For Margaret Beaufort, the disappearance of Edward V was both tragedy and opportunity. The Woodville faction, once dominant through Elizabeth, Queen Mother to the lost princes, was shattered. Discontent spread through the nobility. If York could murder its own heirs, then perhaps it had no right to rule. And in this crack, this fracture in the kingdom's faith, Margaret glimpsed the first true opening for her son. Richard III's reign began in blood and suspicion. The nobility was divided. Some pledged loyalty out of fear, others plotted rebellion in whispered corridors. For Margaret, it was a dangerous game. Her son, Henry Tudor, lived in exile across the sea, a claimant to the throne by his Lancastrian blood. Richard knew it, and he watched her carefully. Margaret had learned long ago how to survive men like Richard. She bowed when expected, swore loyalty with her lips, and cloaked her true intentions in the robes of piety. Her prayers, her fasting, her endless hours in chapels gave her the mask of harmless devotion. Few suspected that behind the folded hands and murmured psalms lay a mother's iron will. In truth, Margaret was already weaving threads of conspiracy. She reached out quietly to those disillusioned with Richard, disinherited Yorkists, grieving Woodvilles, and even powerful nobles who feared the king's ruthless ambition. Among them was Elizabeth Woodville herself, the queen whose sons had vanished into the Tower. Once enemies, the two women now shared a common cause: the overthrow of Richard III. It was during these dark years that the idea of uniting Lancaster and York through marriage began to form. Henry Tudor, exiled in Brittany, could return not only as a Lancastrian heir but as a unifying figure, if he were bound to Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, Elizabeth of York, the last surviving legitimate heir of the Yorkist line. It was an audacious plan, born of desperation and foresight. To most, Margaret Beaufort was still only a widow managing her estates. But in truth, she was quietly aligning the shattered pieces of England's nobility around a single, fragile hope: her son. As rebellion simmered, as Richard tightened his grip, as rumors of betrayal spread like wildfire, Margaret endured. She had survived childbirth at 13, widowhood at 14, and decades of shifting crowns. She would survive this too, and she would not rest until the Tudor name was written into the heart of England's destiny. When Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the throne in 1483, England stood in shock. Once trusted as protector of his young nephew Edward V, Richard instead declared the boy illegitimate, cast aside the claim of both princes, and crowned himself Richard III. The princes, confined to the Tower of London, were never seen again. The disappearance became the stain upon his reign, but Richard pressed forward with ruthless determination. Richard was not without strength. He was a warrior king in the old mold, hardened by battle, shrewd in politics, and feared for his decisiveness. He traveled widely across his realm, securing oaths of loyalty, rewarding allies, and stamping out plots before they could ignite. To many in the north of England, he was even admired, a fair-handed ruler who dispensed justice swiftly. But beyond those strongholds, suspicion lingered. A crown seized through the silencing of children was one carried on fragile ground. Every monarch required legitimacy, not just power. Richard had stripped his brother Edward IV's children of their birthright and alienated the Woodville family, who had once held sway at court. Disinherited nobles whispered in private chambers. Old wounds between Yorkists and Lancastrians festered anew. Though Richard wore the crown, the kingdom did not yet wear him comfortably as its king. And in the shadows, one woman's quiet resolve began to weave an answer to Richard's tyranny. Margaret Beaufort, who had endured a lifetime of survival, now sharpened her gaze upon the throne. Her son, Henry Tudor, long exiled in Brittany, was Lancaster's last great hope. But alone, Henry's claim was too fragile. Margaret knew his only path to the crown lay not in Lancaster's name alone, but in uniting it with York's. It was an unlikely meeting of minds. Margaret Beaufort, the devout and relentless mother of Henry Tudor, and Elizabeth Woodville, the disgraced queen whose sons, the lost princes, were believed murdered by Richard. Once rivals, they now shared a common enemy. Both women had been pushed aside by the ruthless ambitions of men. Both had a child whose future hung in the balance. And so, in whispered conversations and coded letters, a pact was formed. The agreement was simple in principle, daring in execution. Should Henry Tudor land in England and seize the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. The union would bind Lancaster and York, ending decades of civil war by fusing the two bloodlines into one. It was not merely marriage, it was strategy in its purest form. Elizabeth Woodville promised her support, rallying what remained of her family's influence. Margaret worked tirelessly to gather allies, enlisting powerful figures like the Duke of Buckingham, who turned against Richard. Conspiracies swirled. Plots rose and fell. One early attempt in 1483 collapsed disastrously, with Buckingham executed. Yet Margaret did not waver. Her survival depended on subtlety. Outwardly, she remained the obedient subject, kneeling in prayer, serving her household, speaking of loyalty. But beneath that mask, she wrote letters in cipher, smuggled funds to Brittany, and urged her son to prepare. Henry Tudor, the boy who had grown in exile, was now called upon to become a man who would gamble everything for England's crown. The stakes were immense. If Henry failed, he would die a traitor, and Margaret's life would likely be forfeit. But if he succeeded, if the pact held, the Tudors would rise from obscurity to forge a dynasty that might finally end England's torment. On the morning of August 22, 1485, two armies faced one another at Bosworth Field. On one side stood Richard III, armored in white boar insignia, his crown carried upon his helmet, determined to prove his might in open combat. On the other was Henry Tudor, leading a smaller but resolute force, his banner marked with the red dragon of Cadwallader, a nod to his Welsh ancestry. The outcome was not merely a matter of numbers, but of loyalties. The Stanley family, powerful magnates of the realm, stood between the two sides. Their allegiance was uncertain. Their decision would tip the scales. Margaret Beaufort, shrewd as ever, had worked tirelessly to ensure that her husband, Lord Thomas Stanley, would favor her son. As the battle raged, Richard fought with the ferocity of a man who knew everything was at stake. When he saw Henry vulnerable on the field, Richard spurred his horse in a desperate charge, aiming to end the rebellion with his own sword. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer, and for a moment, the crown seemed safe. But fate, and Margaret's careful web of alliances intervened. The Stanleys moved at last, throwing their forces behind Henry. Richard was surrounded. The king refused to flee. Chroniclers tell us he cried, "Treason!" as he fought on, hacking through enemy lines, striking blows until he was dragged from his horse and struck down. Richard III died upon the battlefield, the last English king to do so. His crown was found in the mud, plucked up, and placed upon Henry Tudor's head. With that, the Wars of the Roses ended. Margaret Beaufort's gamble, her years of prayer and plotting, had borne fruit. Her son was no longer a distant exile. He was Henry VII, King of England. The union of Lancaster and York through Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York would give birth to the Tudor dynasty, an era that would reshape England forever. For Margaret, victory was not simply the triumph of ambition but the vindication of endurance. She had survived child marriage, widowhood, political exile, and the bloodshed of decades. Now, at last, she stood as the mother of a king and the silent architect of a new age. When the crown was set upon Henry Tudor's head at Bosworth in 1485, it was not only a coronation for a new king, it was a triumph for the woman who had engineered it all. Margaret Beaufort, who had once been a pawn shuffled across the board of dynastic wars, emerged now as the mother of the sovereign. From that moment, she would be known at court by a title as unique as her position. My Lady the King's Mother. No English king's mother before her had claimed such status. Queen's Dowager had held influence, but never a woman who had not herself been a queen. Margaret's new standing was carved out not by custom but by the force of her will and her son's gratitude. At Henry VII's coronation, she walked alongside the queen consort, Elizabeth of York, as if to remind the world that the Tudor crown had been won as much by her prayers and plots as by her son's sword. She occupied a strange place, straddling reverence and authority. Always draped in sober religious attire, Margaret projected humility, yet everyone at court knew she was no passive matron. She styled herself not merely as a mother but as a guardian of the realm's moral order. She signed documents with her own name, kept her own estates, and administered justice in her lands with a rigor that rivaled the king's own officials. For the first time in her life, Margaret could act openly. She had endured her childhood marriage, survived widowhood, and navigated decades of civil war with quiet strategy. Now she stood in the light of victory, the most powerful woman in England, not as a queen, but as a kingmaker who still lived to shape the age she had created. Margaret's influence did not rest on ceremony alone. She cultivated an active role at the Tudor court, guiding her son through the fragile early years of his reign. England was still scarred by decades of conflict, and Henry VII faced rebellions almost immediately. Pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Yorkist heirs. In these moments of uncertainty, Margaret counseled prudence, encouraging Henry to consolidate power not only with the sword but with marriage, alliances, and careful finance. Her partnership with Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, her fourth husband, proved politically advantageous. It was Stanley's timely intervention at Bosworth that had delivered victory to Henry. Afterward, the couple lived largely apart, each attending to their own power bases, but theirs was a practical alliance. Stanley remained a formidable regional magnate, and Margaret, by her son's side, helped ensure the Stanleys' interests were woven into Tudor stability. Together, they represented the fusion of local might and dynastic legitimacy that Henry VII needed to keep his crown secure. At court, Margaret maintained a blend of piety and authority that impressed both allies and rivals. She endowed colleges at Cambridge, championed learning and religion, and cultivated an image of the devout mother while quietly involving herself in statecraft. Her hand could be felt in the marriages arranged for her grandchildren, in the patronage of scholars, and in the moral tone of Henry's reign. Though Elizabeth of York was queen, it was Margaret who often overshadowed her. The court knew that the king deferred to his mother's counsel more than to his wife's, and some whispered resentment lingered. Yet Elizabeth and Margaret maintained a working relationship, bound by their shared interest in the dynasty's survival. The marriage of Henry and Elizabeth had healed the wounds of Lancaster and York, but it was Margaret Beaufort who guarded that union's legacy, ensuring no rival faction could break the fragile peace. Her influence extended beyond Henry VII's reign alone. She had her eyes set on the future, particularly the young boy who would one day become Henry VIII. Margaret doted on her grandson, seeing in him the embodiment of the dynasty she had fought so long to establish. She took an interest in his education, ensuring he was schooled not only in the classics but in the duties of kingship. To Margaret, the boy's upbringing was not merely a family matter but a dynastic necessity. By the time Henry VII lay on his deathbed in 1509, Margaret Beaufort was nearly 70, her health worn by years of labor and devotion. Yet even in her final months, her will remained unbroken. When Henry VII died, Margaret stepped forward once more, orchestrating the smooth succession of her grandson. She arranged the funeral of the old king with solemn dignity, and she guided the new court for young Henry VIII, ensuring that her family's legacy did not falter in the uncertain days of transition. For just a few months, she lived to see the dawn of her grandson's reign. In June 1509, she attended the coronation of Henry VIII, standing at Westminster Abbey as the dynasty she had forged took its second generation of power. She must have felt the sweep of history in that moment, from the frightened girl who had borne a child at 13, to the matriarch whose blood now sat enthroned in triumph. Her death came only days later, in the quiet of her prayers. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, near the great figures of England's history, her tomb carved by the master artisan Pietro Torrigiano. There, she was remembered not as a forgotten consort or sideline noblewoman, but as the formidable Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of the Tudor dynasty. Her legacy was not simply dynastic. She had redefined the role of women in politics, showing that patience, resilience, and quiet determination could wield as much power as armies. Without her, Henry VII might never have returned from exile, nor married Elizabeth of York, nor united the warring houses of England. Without her, the Tudors might never have reigned. And through the Tudors, her influence stretched into centuries to come. In Henry VIII, who transformed England with the Reformation. In Elizabeth I, who presided over a golden age. Each of them, in their splendor and in their ruthlessness, carried something of Margaret's will, the unyielding resolve of a woman who had once been written off as a pawn, and who instead became the architect of a dynasty. From obscurity to ascendance, from pawn to power broker, Margaret Beaufort's story closes not with silence but with triumph. The Wars of the Roses had been a game of crowns where men spilled blood for ambition. But in the end, it was a mother's endurance that outlasted them all. Margaret Beaufort's life proves how one determined woman reshaped England's destiny, not with armies, but with strategy, faith, and an unshakable will. Her story reminds us that history isn't always written by the kings who wore the crown, but sometimes by those who placed it on their heads. So here's the question. Backhand index pointing right. If you had lived in Margaret's time, would you have seen her as just a mother, or as the quiet architect of the entire Tudor dynasty?